Hello, my name is Mark Hunt. I'm a neuropharmacology researcher, and I've served as a reviewer for around 10 different academic journals, mainly in the area of biomedical science. I'm also the founder of eCorrector, a scientific editing and proofreading company that helps non-native speakers of English improve the level of their English so that it meets the standards required by international peer-reviewed journals. The purpose of this talk is to take you behind the scenes of the peer review process. So essentially from the moment that you click submit to the moment you receive the decision letter from the journal editor. I'll be looking at what is peer review, who are the peer reviewers, and I'll be using an example of a peer review form so that it will give you an idea of the sort of things that reviewers really look for and analyse when they review your paper. So a couple of things to say right at the start. If you are ever asked to review a paper, try to accept it. You'll learn a lot. It will improve your own work. When you review a paper and the editor sends the decision letter back to the authors, you are normally CC'd into that email. So you get, of course, to see your own comments, but you get to see the comments of other reviewers as well that also reviewed the same paper. So it's interesting to compare what you got with what the other reviewers got, and you'll pick up on different things, and it will strengthen your own work in the future. When you submit your work to be published, very important, make sure the reviewer is not the first person to be critically analysing your work. You need to get colleagues to do this, and you need to be as well quite self-critical when you're writing your work. So when authors submit their work to a journal, the journal editor initially looks at the work. This is the case for most journals, say that are impact factor around 4 or above, but the editor or section editor will look at the work, and they'll initially evaluate it, and they'll decide, yes, it's suitable for this journal, or no, it's not suitable. And this normally takes about a week, slightly longer. Of course, if it's rejected by the initial journal pre-screen, it's very disappointing. But as mentioned, some of these journals are the top quality journals, so they are difficult to get into. The purpose is that the journals just don't want to waste a lot of the reviewer's time, a lot of the author's time by reviewing papers that are ultimately unlikely to be published. So that's the purpose of the journal pre-screen. If you get past the journal pre-screen, then of course you're very happy. That's the initial step. But then the next step is also equally, if not more important, and this is the reviewer's comments. So the editor sends out your paper to be reviewed, normally by 2 to 3 people. Then the editor receives the responses back, and then they send that on to the author, and the author has the opportunity to make the revisions, and then it goes back to the editor, and then it probably goes back to the reviewers. And then ultimately a decision is made either to accept, reject, or further revisions. And this is typically the standard procedure that most manuscripts go through before they're eventually published. And it takes 2, maybe 3 months for reviewers to do their initial review and for you to receive your response. So it's a long process. When you're submitting your paper to a journal, often you're asked to suggest reviewers. Now, this is very helpful. It helps the editor because they can find people that are suitable. They can identify people that are suitable or experts in their area, but you help the editor by providing them with potential reviewers. You need to provide their email, of course, their details. It can't be people that you've closely worked with or collaborators. They need to be independent experts. You can also suggest reviewers that can be excluded. So for example, competing labs, if you don't want to share make sure that other people don't read your work before it's published. I've never suggested reviewers to exclude, but make sure that you fill in the reviewers to include. If you don't, it will slow everything down. So try to include as many as you can, at least 6 potential reviewers. This will help speed up the pace at which your paper is dealt with by the editor and the editorial staff. When you submit your paper,
There's normally a panel. It looks something like this. This is a paper that I submitted very recently. And you can go back and you can see the status. So this paper is submitted to a journal called Biological Psychiatry, which is quite a high impact factor journal. And this paper is at that initial editorial pre-screen. I have no idea whether it's going to be rejected initially, whether it will go on to review. It's still at that initial stage. So within a week, I hope to find out what happened with this, whether it's gone on for further review, or which I hope is the case, of course, or the latter. So the peer review process. Peer review is widely supported by most scientists. It's the most common way that manuscripts are evaluated. It's peer review. It's single blind, so this means that the reviewers know who the authors are, but in most cases, the authors don't know who the reviewers are. Some journals, like Frontiers, they encourage much more a sort of collaborative interactions between reviewers and authors, and the reviewers and the editors are published alongside the names of the authors in the publications. Normally it's a footnote. The reviewers and the editors are published, their names are published as a footnote, but they're recognised in some journals, not most. In most cases it's anonymous. Usually at least 2 reviewers are selected, can be more, but normally 2 to 3 is about average. And it takes a long time for a reviewer to review a paper. So if you're going to accept to do this, then it will probably take you between 5 to 10 hours to review it. Reviewers are typically given about a month to do this, even though it's because they're busy people. You know, reviewers don't have a lot of time. They can't stop what they're doing for your paper. They will fit it into their busy schedule and give it sufficient time. And often a reviewer will look at it one day, formulate an idea quite quickly, and then look at the paper again, go back to it, read around the subject, go back to it, and then make a final decision about what they consider the quality of the work to be. The goal of peer review is to make the studies better, even if they suggest that your study should not be published in that particular journal. They'll give a good justification, or they should do. So it essentially acts for quality control for a journal. You want to be submitting work that is of comparable quality to your target journals. So if you've got not substantial findings, but still findings that are worthy of publication, you don't want to send them to these higher tier journals. For example, if they're confirmatory experiments. But if you've got something new, a new mechanism, some treatment that might be effective, some new understanding that is quite fundamental, then you can aim for these higher journals, providing that you've carried out the necessary experiments in sufficient detail. Then you can aim for higher journals. So who are the reviewers? Often reviewers are considered to be a bit menacing and a bit fearful, but fearless, but they're not all like that. I'm a reviewer. I've reviewed quite a few papers, and hopefully I'm not like this. And the reviewers that have reviewed my work, and probably your work, are not all like that. You can get 1 or 2. But in most cases, the reviewers are not so nasty. The reviewers are typically peers. They're people that are of similar standing to the authors. They've got a lot of expertise in the topic of the text, so they will have almost certainly published similar work to what you're in the same field as what you are trying to publish. They're experts in the topic or the main part of the paper. They might not be experts in the whole of the methods that have been used, but they're experts in a lot of the main points. So for example, if your paper combines electrophysiology with genetic models of a disease, you might not necessarily, you might get one reviewer who is more experienced in electrophysiology and a second reviewer that's more experienced in generation of genetic models. They won't necessarily be experts in the whole of the paper, although you would expect them to have a reasonable understanding of everything. They're nearly always publishing scientists, so the reviewers have nearly always got a good PubMed record, most of them. They're invited by the journal editors. So you make your recommendation of six or so reviewers who you think are suitable, but the editor decides. They might not decide to use any of them, but they'll almost certainly use at least one, maybe two of those people that you suggest. And it helps the editor. Reviewers don't have a lot of spare time. As you know, if you're a scientist, that there's always so many things that you want to do, so many papers that you want to write, data that needs analysing. Reviewers are just the same. They don't have a lot of spare time, so they have to fit in work of reviewing a paper amongst all these other things that they've got to do. Reviewers do this voluntarily. They don't get paid for it. And in most cases, their names are not known. They're anonymous. But, you know, there are lots of advantages with being a reviewer. You get to see the comments from other reviewers. You get to see work before it's published. You have a say in deciding whether something warrants publication or not. And as long as you can justify your comments, then that's the purpose of peer review. It's to give an informed opinion about a piece of work that's been submitted. As mentioned, you can select your reviews to include or exclude. When you submit a paper to be published, if it goes past the editorial pre-screen and the editor sends out letters inviting potential reviewers, a potential reviewer will get something like this. This is an invitation I got from schizophrenia research to review a paper. The reviewers get to see, of course, the title, normally the author names, and they get to see the abstract. And based on this information, the reviewer decides, yes, they accept, or no, they don't. They might not feel competent in the area of work. They might not have time. Hopefully, they'll see the abstract, and they'll think, that's very interesting. It's in my area. I want to see what they've done. So the reviewer just decides to accept or decline the invitation to review. This is a typical reviewer evaluation form. Everything is evaluated by the reviewer. The language is very important. Of course, the science, the figures, are they satisfactory? Do they explain everything? Have you cited the literature appropriately? Are your methods valid? Are your statistics valid? Does your data support the conclusions, or are your conclusions completely not in line with what your results show? Very importantly, is the work original? Because if you're confirming previous work, then it's not so interesting. Has it been carried out thoroughly? Is it very significant to a particular field? So, for example, you don't want to be submitting work on experimental models, cellular models, computational models to journals that primarily publish clinical work. Equally, clinical work, these specific fields are often, the journals are often very specific to particular fields. So you want to make sure that that your submission is relevant to what that journal normally publishes. And the writing is important. So it's important to pay attention to everything, the science for sure, but to make sure that your written English comes across well. And then a reviewer will be asked at the bottom of this form to suggest minor revisions, moderate revisions, substantial revisions. There's accept and reject as well, which isn't shown here. A reviewer might not be satisfied with the work and recommend reject straight away. And then in the middle, you're asked to write sort of a detailed commentary about the paper that you've reviewed. As mentioned, reviewers recommend reject, major revision, minor revision, accept. These are the four main categories, and each reviewer makes their own independent decision. This goes back to the editor. Then the editor will send out a letter to the author. This is a different journal, this different paper that I submitted. Unfortunately, it was rejected straight away. I got the reviewer's comments, and you receive a very polite letter from the journal saying that, I'm sorry, this paper is not of relevance to this particular journal, isn't suitable for this particular journal. And then you have to think where else you can send it to. If you get acceptance, brilliant. You know, this is often after several rounds of review, but your paper eventually gets accepted. Brilliant. So of course you're very happy. Most likely, you are asked to do major revisions of your work. This is another paper that I submitted. It was published last year, and the reviewers go through the paper, and they provide a detailed response, and then you have to respond to all of their comments. I will have a separate talk on how to respond to reviewers' comments at a later date. So at this stage, the author receives the comments back from the reviewers, and they have to make their changes. They make the changes to the manuscript, changes to the responding to the reviewers' comments individually, to making sure that everything is covered. And when you think you've made your necessary changes, and when you've replied appropriately to the reviewers' comments, you send it back to the journal. And then the editor decides, okay, do they accept your changes? Do they think it's just not good enough? They send it back to the reviewers to get their opinion. That's normally what happens. And then the editor makes a final decision, which might also be to go back to the authors, and this time, instead of it being major revisions, it's minor revisions. It's often, you know, papers, when they go through this process, normally you get major revisions and then minor revisions and then accept. That's often what happens. So this last slide just is a little bit more light-hearted. There's a journal called Environmental Microbiology, and they actually publish the comments made by reviewers, and some of them are really cutting. For example, like this: hopeless, seems like they've been asleep and are not up to recent work on metagenomics. The purpose of the present study escapes me. I love this one. To be a bit rude, it does look like a copycat of our studies, which the authors cite repeatedly. That is very embarrassing. And this makes sure, this can easily happen, this third comment. The authors have overanalyzed their data. Everything that is written is obvious from figure 2. So make sure that doesn't happen to you. You want to have your paper tell a nice story. Don't have all of the data in one figure and then basically repeat that, different aspects of that figure throughout in the subsequent parts of the paper. Reviewers, as well as being harsh, can be very nice. Very much enjoyed reading this one and do not have any significant comments. Wish I'd thought of this one. That's a lovely comment. I've never had that, but maybe one day. Could become a major highlight of the journal for many years to come. Really nice. Wow, this is a clear keeper. Merry Christmas. So I think on this note, I'm going to end this presentation. I will, as mentioned, have a follow-up, which will be about how to deal with the response to reviewers. I'll be showing examples of some of my my own responses that might help authors that are in the process of writing their rebuttal letters to journals. Okay, thank you.